Welcome to the Mead Art Museum. I am Lisa Crossman, Curator of American Art and Arts of the Americas. It is my pleasure to be here today remotely with June Edmonds, an artist based in Los Angeles, and we're going to focus our conversation today on her ongoing flag series, one of which, Conviction 6, we have here in the gallery. It's a new acquisition by the Mead Art Museum and is currently on view in the exhibition Founding Narratives.
I'm joining you from Los Angeles, actually San Pedro, which is part of LA, just south of LA, about 25 miles. This series started in 2017, sort of at the end of the year. It really came from a dream that I had. That was a series of flags, of these Black flags that were just kind of draped and really sort of lifeless looking, to tell you the truth. And how I knew they were flags, I don't know, because they were very dark, they were Black. And so when I think about what could have motivated me to even have that dream was, just a few months earlier, I was in Kentucky for a residency at the Artist Residency Studio in Paducah. And so I was in the South for the very first time in my life. And then the idea of going on this residency in 2017 was much different than the original thought, because just a few months later, there was a transition of power and sort of this transition that was going on in the country. I still wanted to go, and I still was excited to go, to go to the studio. In fact, the studio was owned by Alonzo Davis, who is of Los Angeles and started the Brotman Gallery here. So it felt like a very safe place to be. One trip that I took when I was there was a road trip, and it was to go to Memphis, Tennessee. And I was excited to go there. We were on some roads, highways to go there, but the highways are very different than they are here in California, in Los Angeles in particular. If you get on the 405 here, you're sort of above and there's walls, and you don't really see what the city looks like in many cases when you're on the freeway. So you're pretty isolated and cut off from the city when you're on the highway. But that, I learned, is not the case, or at least it wasn't the case from Paducah, Kentucky to Memphis. And so you really did go through the towns. There were street lights and everything. And at one point during this trip, there was a house really high on the hill with a huge Confederate flag. And we don't see much of that here. We hear about that in the South, and those flags being on trucks and that kind of thing. But just sort of on the top of the hill, sort of the declaration that made was very jarring to me. And I do believe, that was sort of lodged in my mind from that experience. Paducah's like right on the Ohio River. And so I was interested in the history, just sort of the history of that area, and learned about an enslaved woman by the name of Margaret Garner, who was the focus of the fiction book Beloved by Toni Morrison. In 2017, I was blessed enough to get a grant from the city. So the grant is called the COLA Fellowship, Artist Fellowship. With that money, I was able to get a studio. So I had a studio for the first time in my life, like a good studio. I was in the studio and working on a number of pieces at the same time. And so the dream sort of came at that time. The vision was of these draped flags, but I had never done anything like that before. So I had in my mind, it's like, well, you'll do that eventually, but I'm going to do this in a way that's sort of more comfortable for me, which is sort of that way of laying down paint, very textural and organized, if you will. Also, have it sort of work with the body of work that I'm working on. All right. So the body of work that I was working on was decidedly this palette, a palette of primary colors that sort of go to skin tones, if you will. So primary colors that go to browns. And one of the pieces that I had done at the same time, its name was Unina, it was a vulva of these colors, sort of a reaction to, sort of a more diverse, if you will, definition of what a vulva actually looks like. Number one, and number two, Anina meaning mother in Zulu language, which is of South Africa, which is where, some of the first art, cave art, was found that predates the French cave art, designating this as sort of the mother of all. The colors sort of connect in all cases, sort of reclaiming sort of ownership, if you will, because ownership is such a thing really in American history. Like my ancestors, their whole existence was sort of this claiming and reclamation of ownership of self. That was sort of the decision to go on and do this flag. I'm going to do one, I'm going to do it for this show. I'm not really sure, it's like in the corner of the studio, but it fits in with this body of work because of that. It wasn't really a series, it was one, and sort of the vulva, I was working sort of on these abstract circles, if you will. And it was just interesting to me that the feedback, and even for me, sort of the most interesting parts of the circles, or very interesting parts, is where the circles overlap, right? And so it makes this shape, that in sacred geometry is called the vesica pieces. What that represents in sacred geometry is sort of this birthing channel, if you will, from one realm, non-physical to physical realm, so that is really sort of what I was focusing on in the painting, and that one painting happened to be the most literal, if you will, or physically literal, if you will. These works being vertical was just so automatic for me. It wasn't even a consideration for them to even be any other way. When I think about other flags, which I wasn't thinking about at the moment, it was just a dream. And then I was like, okay, I'm gonna paint it. How can I not think of David Hammond's, right? And how can I not think of Jasper Johns and the direct connections to those two artists? David Hammond's is not only creating a flag, but a political banner. And Jasper Johns not being as concerned about the symbolism, and this is just about expression as art. So I just happen to be concerned with both of those things. I'm concerned, about the painting so much. And I have a desire to sort of counter the bannering of these other flags, countering how that Confederate flag made me feel, on the top of the hill, how others, wearing a American flag on their lapel, and somebody else not wearing an American flag on their lapel, and how certain factions, give that meaning. This depth as well that I'm wanting to get into the flag. So the fact that they're upright, I hadn't thought of them being any other way, but I don't want them hung any other way either, so, and that's just sort of an instinctual reaction that I'm having, about it. I see them very loosely related to portraiture. They're really sort of more of essence of people that are are very American to me. It's really sort of more of acknowledging the ideas that this person stood for. The larger flags are named after individuals for the reasons that I mentioned earlier. I am interested in the paint, kind of doing exercises in paint, if you will. So, some of the flags are very dark, some aren't, some are in between, all of them are brown. I am as much interested in sort of creating this painting about paint than I am about the concept of the work. Whenever I finish one or I finish three or however many are in the studio, there's like four right now in the studio, I think, okay, what about this and what about this? The convictions are color studies in many ways, but they're part of the body of work. The body of work was titled in 2019 for a show that I had at Luis de Jesus, Los Angeles, Allegiances and Convictions. It's, one representation of an opposing conviction to the more exclusionary conviction. So they're all sort of studies in that idea, those ideas. And then there's some kind of history, some portion of history to me that I want to research, or some history that I happen to be learning about if I'm reading about something else. For instance, this summer I was reading a book by Brittany Cooper called Beyond Respectability. She talks about Mary Church Terrell, who another painting that was shown with this one was kind of named after, which was the Capital Chasm painting. This particular book is very good in-depth study, about just a few of these women that were race women in the time of W.E.B. Du Bois. Mary Church Terrell saw her as sort of somebody that will get the baton after, W.E.B. Du Bois, along with Ida B. Wells, who is sort of, has an interesting relationship. So just to hear some of her essays and the way she sort of describes her work, was very inspiring as well. She uses a term called organized anxiety. I'm telling you about sort of this anxiety that sort of this other thing produces in me personally, probably other people I know. I'm just like, wow, this is kind of what I'm doing with paint. I'm sort of organizing this anxiety sort of with this repetition, and sort of getting in control of it, sort of the best I can. It's very organic, I think, overall, but I might be doing some other reading somewhere else and sort of learn about somebody. Like I was working on a public art proposal at the beginning of the year and learned about a very important lawyer, civil rights lawyer and judge here in LA, Lauren Miller. And, so I'm reading this, I'm like, oh, he gets a flag, but it's, but it's for something else. So it could be it might not be named directly after that person, but part of something that is said by them. It might be part of a quote. It might be what is said about them, so in many different ways. And I won't say I've done a whole lot of research about Reconstruction or, Civil War. I've always been so fascinated with the history, especially of Reconstruction. I remember being in the third grade, summer school class, Black history, and learning just a few words about Reconstruction and just feeling like it was the saddest American history, you're in the third grade, but it just really hit me, and it always has and always will, as we recycle these histories over and over again. It's like, okay, I'm just going to stop or I'll be painting this forever. You know what I mean? And sometimes you put that last brushstroke on and you're finished, but still a few years later you look back and you want that painting back and you want to work on it again. The focus will absolutely change. The focus of the subject matter will absolutely change. I might paint another one of these. I might paint another figurative painting. I do many times have a narrative going on, while I'm painting the picture, but I don't think that the paint sort of translate maybe a more specific narrative that I might have. I think about what experience somebody might have when they're in front of it, or even what someone may have told me about being in front of it. And basically, they kind of stand in front of it and look at the paint and at some point realize it's a flag. I think that perhaps at that time, someone might ask themselves, why is this flag painted like this? I think that this will generate a narrative. I think that they would identify and connect to the title of these small ones, which are numbered convictions, and identify it with their own narrative that they might come up with, where if it's another painting like the Capitol Chasm painting, they'll read about Mary Church Terrell and maybe go home and look her up and then be amazed by her. It's amazing being in a show with these artists, and I'm learning about these artists. I mean, I already knew about Robert Duncanson, for instance. So it's amazing to be in an exhibition with Robert Duncanson, who sort of painted this painting at a time that I'm sort of connecting to and referring to sort of in these paintings. And so that painting was painted, I think, in 1862, right? So during slavery, and he's evidently a free man that is able to sort of go to this place and paint about his experience, which is, you look at this painting and it's so beautiful and pristine. And here is this Black man in 1862 having this experience. And then he sort of echoes it in the man in the boat, who is also Black, having this experience with him. So that's pretty amazing. Deborah Dancy's work, of course, where she's calling the names, that's super powerful. And I'm loving that connection to that work as well. The work by the Japanese artist Yasuo Kuniyoshi. I don't know what that painting is of, but I'm from California, and so what I'm seeing is this woman saying, I'm leaving this camp, I'm out this window, just sort of the little bit of landscape that you could see. Like I said, I don't know the history of that painting, but it reminds me of other paintings that I had seen in internment camps. And I just appreciated sort of the matter of fact, like, yeah, I'm leaving. Domestic life, whatever, but she was out the window, literally. I think that the conversation does belong there, sort of at this huge, amazing learning institution. It belongs in a gallery like that. what you were saying about sort of filling in the gaps, see, that's what's missing, so it's, for museums in general, it's like, when I walk in, am I going to consider this place uh, some place that is reinforcing white supremacy or not? So hopefully that part of the gap, these gaps will be filled. You see that painting of George Washington, and what's the purpose of that painting to begin with? What's the purpose of these monuments to begin with? To crystallize Jim Crow. When you think about the monuments, they went up like decades after the Civil War. These symbols of white supremacy, having a place where sort of the reminders of our histories exist, but in a different context, just as everything. So that painting of George Washington, maybe when I was in grade school, was right next to the flag, and we were to pledge our allegiance to that. I am glad that we're sort of getting beyond that, and that sort of learning about these people more generally. In other words, the general population kind of knows where his teeth came from by now, knows he owned people, humans, at that time. I think that it gives us a place to get a more honest telling of our history. You want people to be in the presence of your art, just like you yourself want to be in the presence of art. It being in a postcard is fine, because of a lot of things. I mean, way back when I was coming up, when we were having art shows, we made postcards and we sent them out to come to our shows, so it was to sort of hopefully garner some enthusiasm of, actually wanting to see the real thing. Or you might be in a museum and you saw this amazing painting and you don't want to leave it, and then you get the postcard and it sort of serves as a sort of part of a diary maybe of your life. It's just kind of notes of something you've seen, and you could even pretty much recreate that experience by looking at that postcard. So I see them sort of as kind of a middleman, to either get you to want you to come, or hopefully have a memory of being there in front of it. So I think that's something that we all have to deal with. I mean, I don't, you can't do anything about that. You can get a good photographer, you can get a really good photographer to take pictures that would be better than the pictures you would take to sort of show the texture or whatever it is, that the special quality of the work that you're trying to communicate. But before internet, there were books, we would look through books, and the images were even smaller, right? And even flatter. When you actually see that work of art, it can still be just an amazing experience that can only happen in front of that work of art. For the flags, they're all acrylic. So it's been about 2.5 years that I've been using acrylic. I actually have been an oil painter my whole life and switched to acrylic when I did that residency in 2017, only because I needed something to dry. I needed it to dry in a day. These paints would be very different in oil. One of my problems had always been keeping the brilliance of dark colors, with oil. I just noticed they always, sort of die down to something matte and not as rich. So I know you can sort of glaze it afterwards, but I just was never interested in glazing. I just wanted my experience with paint just to be about painting. 3.5, 4, and I'm saying I'm almost finished with a very big painting. So I have about 4 completed paintings in the studio. And I'd like to have that in the studio. I would imagine any artist does, because, you know, and I might see a color in one, or certain colors in one that surprised me. You know, it's like, oh, I hadn't used these colors. Like when I look at this one, I see sort of like this green, yellowish, and this reddish. And I'm thinking, oh, those work well together. I really, you know, and I might not have had the intention to do that, but that's sort of what I see. And so the next question would be, okay, how would that yellow and that red look with, and then I'll sort of fill in the blank, you know, like another kind of purple, you know, so that's sort of, and what if that purple were over on this side, you know, so I just sort of allow for that kind of rabbit hole venture, you know, when I'm around, you know, another painting or another series of paintings. And the other question was, you know, what's next? Oh, what's next? I'm looking, I don't want to tell you. I don't want to tell you this series, and the pandemic sort of spurred a reaction, you know, sort of a different reaction. And see, that's the thing about working in the studio. You don't know. Just like when I started this, it's like, ooh, this is so different, you know. So that's kind of what I'm that's kind of what I'm doing now. You know, I'm just working right now with a very, very, very different color palette. That very different color palette sort of symbolizing something different in a way, but still sort of getting into how can I use this palette to sort of work in this painting and work in a series, maybe a very small series, and work with the sort of statement of the work as a whole.